The next panel is Growing Climate Awareness in Southwest Florida. It's our fourth panel, and the presenters include myself, followed by Melissa Baldwin of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, and concluding with Dr. Anna Puszkin-Chevlin from Growing Climate Solutions with a panel Q&A to follow all the panelists' presentations. Next slide. So today I'm going to be sharing a regional climate change vulnerability assessment conducted by the CHNEP in response to a requirement by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that all 28 entities in the National Estuary Program conduct climate change vulnerability assessment as part of their Climate Ready Estuaries initiative. Next slide. 5 individual experts and the public participants of a large public workshop were respectively surveyed in areas relating to climate science and coastal planning. They were asked to review a list of threats that threaten the achievement of specific natural resource management goals, and to rate the risk, the climate risk, on a qualitative scale from low to high as to the likelihood of that risk occurring, and if it did occur, how severe of an impact it might create. You can see a list here of the symbology of the 5 experts and the collective public response, which will be represented in future graphics in this presentation. The primary purpose of conducting a climate change vulnerability assessment here was to identify risks that could inhibit our ability to achieve the comprehensive conservation and management plan objectives, the 5-year strategic plan collectively drafted by all the CHNEP partners, in order to address if those needed to be revised in response to those risk factors. It should be noted that this was done in regards to our 2013 plan objectives, and then that these results were used in the crafting of our 2019 plan, which we are now currently implementing. However, as we conducted it, we found that it also served to identify important disconnects of knowledge and understanding of these climate risks between the experts and the public. This has helped to inform what environmental education needs exist with regards to climate change to implement in our public education and outreach activities. This graph here is an example of where the public thinks there's a low likelihood of sea level risk causing a loss of existing shallow water coastal habitats, while there's consensus amongst the experts that there's a high likelihood of this risk occurring. Finally, we found that this also served to identify potential research needs where there was potential scientific uncertainty reflected by a lack of consensus amongst the experts that were surveyed. The first category we looked at was fish and wildlife habitat protection. Objective 1 centers around protecting, enhancing, and restoring native habitats where physically feasible. And objective 2 is to increase conservation lands within the CHNEP study area. Experts in the public mostly agreed that increased storminess may lead to shoreline erosion, as well as loss of beaches and wetlands, and that sea level rise may shift salinity regimes, constraining oyster habitat and affecting reef productivity, affecting our ability to protect, enhance, and restore native habitats, including aquatic habitats. However, you can see here that there was also significant disconnects between the experts and the public on other climate risk factors, such as whether warming temperatures may affect plant zonation. Experts ranked this as medium to high for its impact on efforts to protect native habitat, as well as also having a high likelihood to occur, whereas the public ranked this as a medium level of impact with a low likelihood to occur. With regards to the risk of ocean acidification may impact shellfish and the condition of habitat created by shellfish, the public ranked the likelihood of that occurrence as low, whereas the experts ranked it as medium to high. This illustrates where potential public education areas are needed to focus on how higher temperatures may affect vegetative communities that serve as important fish and wildlife habitat, as well as how impacts to ocean acidification to shellfish can impact other species, such as oyster catchers, for instance. And as I mentioned, there's even times when the experts themselves did not agree, which could reflect areas of higher level of scientific uncertainty or where additional research might be needed. With regards to impacts on fish and wildlife habitat protection, these were the risks of whether increased temperatures altering evapotranspiration rates and water availability in wetlands, or sea level rise, reducing light penetration and affecting seagrass populations, or also if sea level rise causing existing protection area guidelines to become mismatched or inaccurate, would have any real significant impact on broader fish and wildlife habitat protection efforts. The second category is water quality improvement, which has 4 objectives. The first being to maintain and improve water quality, including bringing impaired water bodies into corrective actions to restore them. Experts in the public mostly agreed that the following risks could reduce our ability to maintain and improve water quality to meet water quality standards. And those include increased storminess that could lead to overloaded stormwater systems, increased nutrient and sediment loading from that, and that warmer temperatures may promote bacteria and algae growth, amongst other climate-related risks. But interestingly, there was also some differences between the public and the experts on whether sea level rise may lead to septic system failure and increased nutrient and bacteria loading, or whether precipitation changes and changes in evapotranspiration rates may alter freshwater flows, affecting salinity and other constituent levels, or even whether sea level rise or precipitation changes could lead to inundation of contaminated areas. The second objective under water quality improvement relates to developing and meeting water quality criteria that are protective of living resources. Experts in the public mostly agreed on all the potential climate risks that could impact this objective, including warming temperatures potentially leading to lower dissolved oxygen levels, and changes in precipitation and evapotranspiration rates potentially altering freshwater flows, affecting salinity and other constituent levels. This shows areas where the public are well informed and sharing a similar knowledge and understanding as the subject matter experts. The third objective under water quality improvement is to reduce severity, extent, duration, and frequency of harmful algae blooms. Again, the experts and the public mostly agreed that the climate risks as follows would affect that objective. Increased storminess leading to overloaded stormwater systems and increased nutrient loading, warmer temperatures potentially promoting algae growth, and sea level rise storminess leading to loss of vegetative buffers. This is interesting because while there's still a lot of research to be done on harmful algae blooms, there seems to be consensus on the foundational issues of the role of stormwater and associated nutrients in contributing to them, as well as temperature, that these are well understood. And there's also a sophisticated understanding that vegetative buffers can help reduce nutrient pollution washing into waters fueling harmful algae growth. The final water quality improvement objective relates to meeting shellfish harvesting standards year-round. Experts in the public mostly agree that warmer temperature can lead to lower dissolved oxygen levels that can promote bacteria growth or disease that would inhibit our ability to meet shellfish harvesting standards. Additionally, there was consensus amongst the experts in the public that ocean acidification impacts shellfish populations and that would be detrimental to meeting this objective. Experts did not agree, however, on whether sea level rise and storminess lead to loss of vegetative buffers and affect water quality in a way that would affect meeting shellfish harvesting standards. And interestingly, the biggest disconnect between the public and the experts with this was regards to whether sea level rise may shift salinity regimes further upstream, constraining oyster habitat and affecting reef productivity, and whether that would affect overall shellfish harvesting. Experts rank this as medium to high likelihood to occur, whereas the public ranked this low likelihood to occur, though they agreed with the experts that if it did occur, it would have a high level of impact. This could highlight a public education need to further explain increased saltwater intrusion and its likely impacts to overall shellfish harvesting and restoration efforts. The final category assessed was with regards to hydrological restoration, with 4 objectives. The first objective was to identify, establish, and maintain more natural seasonal freshwater flow. Experts in the public generally agree that the following climate risks will impact that objective. Increased temperature leading to higher rates of evapotranspiration, precipitation changes leading to reduction in freshwater flows, and the loss of wetlands impacting freshwater flows and drainage patterns were all likely to occur and would be very impactful to hydrological restoration efforts. Experts did not have consensus on whether increased temperatures may affect freshwater demands and alter surface and groundwater flows. The public agreed with two experts who ranked this as likely to occur and as very impactful to hydrological restoration, while other experts felt that there was a lower likelihood and that it would only have a medium impact to those efforts. The second hydrological restoration objective is to restore historical watershed boundaries, where the experts and public mostly agreed that the loss or degradation of wetlands impacting freshwater flows and drainage patterns, as well as sea level rise potentially pushing development inland, altering drainage patterns, were both highly likely and would be very impactful to efforts to restore historical watershed boundaries. Areas of potential scientific uncertainty where experts did not agree centered again around whether increased temperatures would affect freshwater demands and alter surface and groundwater flows so as to affect these watershed boundaries, as well as whether changes in precipitation, temperature, and sea level rise would make restoring historical watershed boundaries potentially unattainable altogether. The third objective involves creating more natural hydrologic conditions to water bodies affected by artificially created structures. The only risk for this category highlighted was illustrates a disconnect between knowledge and understanding of the public and experts. The risk assessed was that sea level rise may lead to more frequent flooding and an increased demand for artificially created drainage and flood protection structures. All experts ranked this as high likelihood and high impact, whereas the public ranked this as low likelihood and medium impact. This illustrates a need to educate the public more on how climate change factors will affect our existing water management and flood control systems, and how we will need to implement measures to improve infrastructure and to restore natural floodways and flood storage capacity to maintain flood protection that people are accustomed to. The last hydrological restoration objective is to improve linkages between local, state, and federal governmental permitting and capital improvement programs affecting water storage, flood control, and water quality. Both risks under this objective were disagreed upon, including increased uncertainty around future environmental conditions making permitting more challenging, and whether changes in precipitation, temperature, and sea level rise may affect planning objectives and priorities in a way that affects hydrological restoration efforts. So there's obviously a lot to unpack here, but generally when the public and the experts disagreed, it was that the public frequently ranked the likelihood of a risk occurring as low when the experts ranked it high. And there was also specific areas that seemed to surface where more public education was needed, such as on ocean acidification and sea level rise impacting habitats, warmer temperatures affecting plant zonation and vegetative communities, and how sea level rise and changes in evapotranspiration rates could affect water quality and hydrological flow. There's also a number of potential research areas around whether sea level rise will reduce light penetration affecting seagrass growth, or whether increased high temperatures will affect freshwater demands, surface and groundwater flows and levels, and whether evapotranspiration will affect wetland hydro periods, as well as a host of other interesting scientific questions outlined here. To look more at the results of this climate change vulnerability assessment, you can find the full report on the chnep.org publications page, as well as read the updated comprehensive conservation and management plan that use the results of this at our chnep.org our plan page. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn it over to the next presenter. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Can you all see me? My name is Melissa Baldwin, and I'm the Director of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action. I'd like to thank you, thank the CHNEP for asking me to speak today and for hosting such a wonderful educational event. I've already learned so much from your experts already. My name is Melissa Baldwin. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And one more. So I'm the director of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action. I'm not a doctor or a scientist. I'm a climate communications specialist, and I have about 15 years of experience talking with the public about climate change and energy issues in Florida. And at Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, we are a coalition of health professionals who are concerned about climate health impacts and who advocate for equitable solutions. Next slide. So I'd like to start with a question, and you've all gotten a lot of education here today, so you might already have some ideas, but when you think about climate change and global warming, the question is, what comes to mind? A lot of times in the public, the thing that comes to mind would be the polar bear or the ice caps. Now, all of you have had a wonderful education today, so you might be more informed. You might be thinking about coastal estuaries or saltwater intrusion, but often the public thinks about things that are far away. And so the problem that we have in communicating climate change is that people see it as a there, them, and then problem. They think it's going to affect someone else, somewhere else, far away in the future. But what we hope to do with the health message is show people that climate change is a here, now, and us problem. It's about health effects, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more today. Next slide. So this is a study that was done by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And they do this study every couple of years. And they ask people all over the country about climate change. The first question that I'm showing you here is, do you think that global warming is happening? And the overwhelming majority of folks say yes. 72% say that yes, climate change is happening. And you see that reflected in those warm colors there, those warm oranges and reds. Next slide. So here's the disconnect, and the speaker before me spoke a little bit about this, where the majority of Americans they agree that global warming is happening, but they don't think that it will affect them personally. So you can see here the cooler colors in blues. That means that only 43% on average of adults think that climate change will harm them personally. And if you look at that number specifically for Lee County, it's even lower, it's 38%. So you can find these maps if you want to do more research and look at the other questions that they ask if you Google Yale Climate Opinion Maps. So it's really important for us to shift this conversation and show people how climate change is harming us now and here. And I think you had some great points earlier in the conversation you just had before this. Go ahead, next slide. So the message that we want to communicate at Florida Clinicians for Climate Action is that climate change is harming our health now. Everyone is at risk, but some people are more vulnerable than others. And if we do nothing to address these risks, these harms are going to increase. We've developed this heat wave mnemonic to help us remember the 8 ways that climate change is affecting our health. There are 8 impacts in 4 categories, and I'll go through the heat wave mnemonic now. H is for heat, illness. E is for exacerbate existing preconditions like heart and lung conditions. A is for asthma. T is for traumatic injury. W is for water and foodborne illness. A is for allergies. V is for vector-borne disease. And E is for the emotional stress brought on by all of those things above. I don't have time to talk in depth about all of these things, but I am going to talk about a few of them, starting with heat. Next slide. So the last 5 years are the hottest 5 years on record. 2016 is the hottest year recorded globally since record keeping began in 1880. 2019 is the second hottest year, and 2020 tied 2016 for the warmest year on record, according to NASA analysis. Next slide. So Florida has also made headlines for our local heat. So you had more record heat in the Southwest Florida. March of 2020 was the hottest month in Florida for the last 126 years. Statewide temperature averages have been higher than normal 57 out of the last 60 months. So heat-related hospitalizations have also increased along with this increased trend that we see in heat. So the heat is bad now, and it is going to get worse. Next slide. So everyone's health is at risk, but there are certain people who are more vulnerable than others. And I like to walk through these vulnerable populations with you because it's really important to think about this as we think about how do we adapt and respond to these changes. So the first category of vulnerable people I want to talk about is often overlooked, but it's really important, that is pregnant women. So pregnant women are at risk. There was a new JAMA study from 2020 that showed that climate change is causing babies to be born sooner and smaller. So preterm birth and low birth weight are the two leading causes of infant mortality, and heat and pollution related to climate change is exacerbating that threat. So pregnant women should always drink lots of water during pregnancy. And when I say lots of water, I mean drink an extra 2 to 4 cups per day of water in addition to the recommended 8 cups. Another high-risk category is people with pre-existing conditions, things like diabetes, high blood pressure, people who have heart conditions or lung conditions, and people who are overweight or obese. These people all face higher risk of heat-related illness. So people with mental illnesses are also at higher risk, especially people with dementia. Another category I want to talk about are low-income people and people who don't have air conditioning and communities of color. Unfortunately, heat-related deaths are 2.5 times more likely among African Americans than non-Hispanic whites. This is due to social determinants of health, and also we see a higher percentage of communities of color concentrated near urban heat islands where you have that urban heat island effect. The next category we want to think about is the elderly. The elderly are actually most likely to die in a heat wave, especially if they're living alone or if they're secluded or if they're on the top floor of an apartment that doesn't have air conditioning. So it's a really good practice to check up on your friends and neighbors during a heat wave, especially if you know there was a power outage or if they don't have access to air conditioning. Older adults are less able to thermoregulate, and they often have pre-existing conditions, both of which are stressors for heat. Next category would be children, especially infants, but also teen athletes, especially football players. They are at increased risk for heat stroke. So you might remember the news story of a Lee County High School football player who died in the summer of 2017 after hours of practice in 90-degree heat. And finally, outdoor workers. So outdoor workers face greater risk because they're exposed to the elements. They're outside working in that heat with the humidity. And think about how this can affect Florida's thriving construction, agriculture, fishing, and tourism industries. These people are exposed to the elements for long periods of time. So their health is at risk, but also it can affect the industry and the economy as well. Next slide. So extreme heat can trigger heart attacks, asthma attacks, problems with kidneys, and diabetes. Prolonged exposure to extreme heat can cause heat exhaustion, heat cramps, heat stroke, and death, as well as exacerbate those pre-existing conditions that I talked about. There's also a growing body of evidence that shows that heat is connected to violence. So when we think about the phrase, when people get hot-headed or when tempers flare, when we are hot, we become more irritable, we're quick to anger. So researchers have actually looked back at history and even connected global and local conflicts to heat waves or extreme weather events. Next slide. So another topic that I want to talk about is air pollution, and it relates to asthma and allergy attacks. We know that we need clean air to be healthy, but when we burn fossil fuels like coal or methane or frack gas in our power plants and gasoline in our vehicles, we're producing air pollution. One type of fossil fuel pollutant is called particulate matter, or PM2.5. These are very tiny particles that when we inhale them into our lungs, they could get trapped there. They're too small to exhale, and so they stay there. They can cause irritation and lung damage. So air pollution can trigger asthma attacks and other heart and lung issues. Just this week, a new study came out that estimates that air pollution from burning fossil fuels caused 8.7 million premature deaths worldwide in 2018. So that's almost 1 out of every 5 deaths in 2018 attributed to air pollution. That research was led by Harvard University in collaboration with the University of Birmingham and the University of Lancaster. So fossil fuel pollution is harming us in two serious different ways. One is it harms us directly through air pollution and poor air quality, but also it exacerbates the warming of the globe, which is triggering these 8 climate health impacts that I've been talking to you about. Next slide. So I want to talk about something that probably all of you have experienced, and that is allergies. So this is something that most people have experienced at one point or another. And climate change through more heat and carbon dioxide is causing flowers to bloom earlier. So it's lengthening the allergy season. So carbon dioxide is also a super fuel for pollen. And so not only does it prolong the allergy season, but the CO2 is causing the pollen to be more virulent and causing it to be more allergenic. So you're more likely to, it's more likely to trigger your allergies. This is especially true for ragweed. A warming climate has increased ragweed pollination and the pollen biomass. And this slide shows the more CO2 in the atmosphere, the more pollen production. So again, climate change is harming our health now, and it's going to get worse if we don't reduce heat trapping pollution. Next slide. So the last thing that I want to talk about is another pesky and sometimes deadly problem. And this is when we think about the heat wave pneumonic, I'm talking about the letter V here for vector-borne disease in the form of mosquitoes and ticks. So mosquitoes love warm, wet weather. And we know that climate change means warmer, wetter weather. And so here's a chart from the CDC showing an increase in mosquito and tick-borne diseases from 2004 to 2016. So warmer temperatures allow mosquitoes to expand their territory so they can cover more ground. They have a greater range. They also, warmer, wetter weather also creates conditions ripe for a longer mosquito season with a prolonged rainy season or more downpours and even some of those puddles where mosquitoes can hatch. And finally, climate change affects the proliferation of mosquitoes because their eggs hatch faster in warmer climates. And we know that mosquitoes can carry sometimes deadly diseases, things like dengue, West Nile virus, Zika, chikungunya. Lyme's disease is another concern that we need to be aware of and watch out for. We've seen tick-borne diseases on the rise as well. So in Lee County, Florida, in September of 2020, somebody was tested positive for West Nile virus. So you have it right there in the community. And that was according to the Lee County Department of Health. Next slide. So I've told you about all of these things, all the different ways that climate change is affecting our health. I didn't have time to go into all 8 of the ways, but I talked about a few of them. Hopefully you're not too depressed. And so I want to transition now to solutions. So at Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, we believe that clinicians have a role to play. Not everybody knows a climate scientist, but everybody knows a doctor or a nurse. And we also know that nurses and doctors are among the most trusted health professionals in America. So we believe that by educating and activating the health voice, that we can begin to have a conversation and educate the public more on the health threats of climate change. So I encourage you to take your smartphone and look at that QR code there that will pull up our website. And if you know a health professional or a doctor or a nurse or a med student, encourage them to learn more about Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, to get involved and to join. We provide monthly educational opportunities for clinicians to enhance their climate literacy. A lot of times doctors and nurses didn't learn about climate change in med school. That's changing now, but in the past it wasn't taught in regular curriculum. So we provide educational opportunities for free for clinicians to enhance their climate literacy, and we also provide them with opportunities to engage, to get involved, especially when it comes to advocating for equitable solutions. So next slide. So I told you all of the bad news. Now here's the good news. The good news is that climate solutions are health solutions. So the quote on the last slide was by Ian Roberts at Clinical Medicine. It said that mitigating climate change presents unrivaled opportunities for improving public health. And that was from Clinical Medicine in 2009. And my point here is that when we change our habits and embrace more active lifestyles like walking more, riding our bikes, driving less, we can address issues like obesity caused from sedentary lifestyle. When we choose a plant-forward diet and we try to eat less red meat, eat less processed meat, we can address issues like heart disease and cancer. And when we transition away from harmful, polluting fossil fuels towards cleaner forms of energy, we can reduce air pollution, clean up our air and water, reduce PM 2.5 that impairs lung function. So all of these chronic diseases, heart disease, cancer, obesity, diabetes, all of these things can be addressed when we embrace health solutions as climate solutions. And in conclusion, next slide. Oh, that's okay. You keep it there. In conclusion, climate change is harming our health now. Everyone is at risk, but there are certain people who are more vulnerable than others. And if we do nothing to address it, these health threats are going to increase. And that's why it's so imperative that we transition away from harmful polluting fuels towards cleaner forms of energy. We can do it for ourselves, we can do it for our health, and do it for our children. And that concludes my talk, and I'll pass it to the next speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Being the third speaker in the panel after lunch, I hope I can be exciting enough to keep you all from yawning after that lunch is settled in. But among this crowd, and when I start to talk, I often say, excuse me, is it okay to talk climate change? And I know in this audience, we are all okay. That's why we're here. Next slide. But when you go out to the public, we often default to the adage like, you never talk politics or religion. So is climate change really okay? Is it okay to talk about climate change? So to get a better handle on that, it's important to understand where people are. Next slide. To do that, I've started to pull together some of the survey data that gives us a sense of where people in South Florida stand on climate change. Specifically, I looked at 4 different data sources. One is the American Climate Metric Survey that was done by Eco America in 2018. It was about 800 responses in this South Florida County area. I also looked at the League of Women Voters Collier County study. They did a qualitative study in 2019 of 80 interviews. We can add that to the Florida Atlantic University Center for Environmental Studies. They've been doing a climate survey statewide every quarter through 2019 and 20 of about 1,300 representatives. That's statewide data. And finally, the gold standard, the Yale program on climate communications and their opinion maps, ones that Melissa shared with you. And I looked at 2020 survey data. Now that's a nationwide study of 25,000 respondents, but what's great about that is they broke it down by county. So what did we find? Next slide. What we find is that there's at least 55 to 56% of Floridians who generally agree that climate change is happening and it's induced by anthropogenic activity, humans. What's interesting is the discrepancy between the Yale data and the FAU data, where in the FAU statewide data, there's more acknowledgement that climate change is happening, but a hefty 34% sort of attributed to natural occurrence. And that data says that only about 11% of our population statewide are what we would deem climate deniers. But the Yale data says that number is a little bit flipped, that there are a larger number of people who outright don't believe that climate change is going on. Next slide. So the Eco America data that goes back 1 year sort of breaks that tie. And we see from the Eco America data that it resembles more of the Yale data. And that would show that a good 2/3 of people in the state believe something's happening with the climate. More than half think or know that it's anthropogenic, but there's a lot of misinformation and there are a lot of climate deniers. If you look at the graph to the right, you'll see that statewide, 28% of Floridians still aren't on board. And in this area, in Collier, Lee, and Charlotte County, you will see that that number is like 33% or 36%, more than a third. And so I've included in some of these slides in quotes or little sentences or snippets from the League of Women Voters interviews. And I won't read them out loud, but read them as I move along, and you will see some of the language that are being used by business leaders and how they are really on the fence. Next slide. What's important is that when you have 1/3 of the folks here denying climate is really changing, and still a large number that don't believe that it's human, it changes the way we talk about it. In fact, what tends to happen is people say, let's just gather around the majority, let's not upset them, and let's talk about adaptation. So regardless of why it's happening and we have to do something about it. So it's okay to talk about changes in land use or preparing emergency management or upgrading our infrastructure so we don't flood. Just don't cross the line and talk about greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation activities, renewable energy, because we lose our audience. And while I do respect that position and I hold it depending on the audience, I really in my heart believe that it's important to educate and that we must educate on the mitigation piece. We can't leave that piece out of the discussion. So then the question is how? Next slide, please. So I think the best approach is to connecting it to the impacts that people are feeling or the ones they are aware of and concerned about. So it's snowing in May. That was a tweet that or a Facebook post that somebody sent me last year out of New York. I've taken pictures of water breaching our seawalls. We've all been out to the mangroves. Next slide. So what does the data say? The data from the Eco America study suggests that in this region, people really feel strongly about preserving our natural assets. 93% agreed that the government should do more to protect our mangroves and wetlands. At least 2/3 say that the algae outbreaks are worse due to climate change. The sea level rise data is also interesting. It alludes to what Melissa was saying. 78% agree that it's a threat, but it's not something that's happening right now. What is happening now and what resonates strongly are the hurricane issues. 83% that agree that extreme weather threatens our community. And after Irma, at least 2/3, almost 3/4 of people in Southwest Florida thought that it's time to prepare more for climate change. Irma was a trigger. Next slide. The FAU data is even more interesting. I love this data source. It asks people, what are they concerned about in terms of climate change? And it's fascinating. Look at the yellow and gray lines. The things that concern people the most are drinking water, followed by the health of the natural environment. Those are those yellow and gray lines that are pretty high. The blue indicates issues that people are not at all concerned about. So where does that highest? Oddly, sea level rise and rain flooding, people aren't really worried about that. And what that tells me is that there's a real educational disconnect. People believe that these factors can be isolated, that one might happen and they should be concerned, but they're not interrelated, because if they understood the dynamics, they would be concerned about all of them pretty evenly. Next slide. So when I talk about climate change, and you should look at the quotes to the right, which are always going to be in that brown color, I try to make it really clear that sea level rise isn't something that's happening in the future. 8 inches of sea level rise have already happened since 1950, and that rate is accelerating. And for us in this audience, we know what that means, but to the general lay public, they don't realize that that's an exponential curve, that it's getting faster. So make it really clear. Over this decade, it's been about 1 inch every 3 years. And when we show them a graph from NOAA of the intermediate or intermediate high, it's not helpful to put it in feet and say 1.8 feet. People can't translate those numbers. What's a third or 0.28 of a foot? Put it in inches so that people can really digest these numbers. By 2030, we're going to have somewhere around a foot, between 9 and 15 inches. And by 2040, it's going to be closer to 2 feet. That is something people can understand, along with showing them pictures of areas that they know. Next slide. The other thing is to connect that sea level rise, which wasn't a big indicator, with something that really is. They were concerned about drinking water. So I talk about saltwater intrusion, and I explain to an audience that we have a freshwater aquifer, we drink from that. And the salt water is under the Gulf, and there is a zone which is mixed. And as sea level rise moves upward, or that line of the salt water will come closer to the wells. And people can relate to the issue of overdevelopment. That's a big topic here. So you explain to people that as more people move here and we develop more and we pump more fresh water, that saltwater intrusion line will move landward. Suddenly, a topic that didn't seem that interesting, like sea level, touches something they're really concerned about, drinking water. Next slide. Likewise, there isn't a big concern about flooding, apparently, or drought, even though they've already experienced 18 inches of rain in one day, or a brush fire shutting down I-75. But if you can relate that to the fact that birds that migrate will no longer have these pools of water to feed for the food that they need on their migratory journey, that somehow tugs at people's hearts. So it's important not to make it abstract, but to connect back these topics to things that people seem to care about. Next slide. Likewise, it's often helpful to connect those heavy downpours, the wetter wets, to the issue of harmful algal blooms, which are, again, related to water supply and drinking water quality. Explaining to people that when the rain comes down hard, it flushes those nutrients into the canal system, that clicks. Likewise, that when it rains, we can overburden our septic systems, and they will percolate up and we will have contamination on our front lawn. It hasn't happened to you, but it may happen to your neighbor. And that flooding isn't clean water. It's not just a bunch of rainwater at the bottom of the road. It's rainwater that's popped up out of our storm drain system. It's contaminated, it's dirty, it's dangerous. It goes out to the Gulf of Mexico and contaminates our estuaries. Those issues, relating that back to those natural assets, that seems to make people listen. Next slide, please. So what Growing Climate Solutions is about is elevating that climate literacy, making sure that people understand how it relates to the natural assets they care about, and then teaching people how to communicate effectively to their community leaders about these issues, showing people that we care. Next slide. We do that by trying to depoliticize climate change and its discourse by using education instead of a policy advocacy approach. We gather organizations in our community that are willing to sign on to the climate discussion. We then depoliticize that. If your church, if your doctor, if your insurance company are all on board, well, suddenly this may be important to you. Likewise, we leverage those partners to reach audiences we couldn't. So they can be role models, but they can also connect us with people that wouldn't normally engage in this discussion. We try to focus a lot on the positive solutions at every level, both the things that people can do individually and how those individual actions add up to something bigger. And we try to train on this communication piece. Next slide, please. So we know that 76% of the we believe and 70% believe that they personally have to take action to reduce the pollution that causes climate change. Yet we also know that only 30 to 35% of adults discuss global warming among friends and family. In fact, 54% believe they should be talking about it, but there's this spiral of silence because is it polite? Are we going to offend anyone? Are we going to engage with a denier and get into an uncomfortable situation? That number is even higher in Southwest Florida. It's 5% lower than the national figure. Next slide. So I try to explain to people how we connect these personal actions to systemic change. And we start with the individual. If we educate that individual about all the things they can do to reduce their carbon footprint, next, one family or one household may reduce their footprint by 15%. But the key comes in the communication. If they take that personal experience that they had, whether it's Meatless Monday or riding their bike to work, and then they meet with their friends and their colleagues, a bridge club or people in their association, and they talk to them, that's where the magic starts to happen. Next, please. So together, let's say I tried Beyond Meat. It was pretty good. I liked it. Suddenly somebody else in the group tastes it and that person tells somebody else, and we start to change the consumer demand. And that helps the local businesses discover that there is a niche for sustainable products, and that percolates its way up to businesses that start reading those changes in consumer preferences. And before you know it, we have new products in the market, and that drives growth. And that's all well and good, and we understand that market approach. But there's more to it than that. Next. Somebody in that group or in one of the groups that you're talking to, they're the head of a company or the director of the human resources division. And they know that now transportation and riding your bike to work could be important, and they may bring that to their company. And then that company's buying habits start to change, and that reinforces the market synergy. Next. Another person may live across the street from the person running for city council, or they may be married to the mayor. And now there's been this discussion and people seem to be on board, and that elected official feels more comfortable proposing a policy at the local level. Next. Another group may say, gee, this was really stimulating. I really believe in this. I'm going to, spend some time with an NGO locally and help support some of these issues that mean something to me. Next. And the last person, well, they don't want to get into politics directly and they don't want to lobby, but they go to church on Sunday. And then on Sunday, they find that there's a green sanctuary committee and they meet with these people. They find comfort in knowing there are others that are still looking at these issues like they are. And when that policy question comes up on the ballot, now the whole church group discusses it and we get all these voters to come out. And so while the systemic change that we started with only does a little thing, it's all the talking about it and perpetuating that knowledge that really goes a long way. Next. And we do want to go there. The data from the surveys show that only 28% of Floridians agree that we're doing enough. 38% believe that government is not doing enough. What's fascinating is that green figure. 33% of the people surveyed didn't know how to answer that question. That means there's a lack of education. If you don't know whether your government is doing enough or not enough, it's because you don't know what they need to do, right? So we clearly know that there's an educational need there, and that's why all the communicating is important. Moreover, if you look at the Yale data, which is really fascinating, 52% believed that local government was responsible for implementing some of these changes. Notice the figures are higher on local government than on state government, and these are Collier and Lee County. In both counties regionally, the majority of people put this responsibility first on local government. Next slide. So when Growing Climate Solutions goes out, we focus on solutions and we bring those solutions in various sectors. Next, please. I'm going to give you an example of two. Transportation is important because in Florida, transportation is 45% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So we tell people that the average American produces 50,000 pounds of CO2. 20% of it, a fifth, is just from driving your car around. So you can conserve fuel by not idling. You can work from home, which has been a huge driver of lowering emissions this past year. We can fly less often. You can purchase an electric bike or a hybrid. You can walk or bike when possible. You can take public transit. In fact, bikes and electric bikes are a growth sector. More companies are creating electric bikes. In the next 10 years, that market's going to grow by 23%. And this is a picture of a Ford Mustang. It's electric. You no longer have to drive a moon vehicle to drive electric. They're cool and attractive. And so we hope that people will make these choices. Next, please. But the idea is, if they were to make the choices, if they become that biker, then through education, they will connect that to larger issues that are systemic in nature. So advocating for complete streets. Once you've tried to ride your bike to work or even to the supermarket, you realize how disconnected our bike lanes might be, or how you wish they were safer. And then when they widen a road, you may pay attention and advocate for a complete street with protected bike lanes and shade and wider sidewalks. This issue may not have resonated with you, but if you tried biking or walking, suddenly this larger systemic issue becomes of concern. Next, please. Likewise, it's really easy to tell people about the benefit of trees. And everyone loves to plant trees, and we educate that trees capture that carbon dioxide. It's important for adaptation because tree shade lowers the ambient temperature by 10 degrees. And as Melissa just pointed out, it's going to get hotter here. We also educate people that tree roots slow rainwater down and it improves water quality. Again, harking back to the issues that really resonate with folks, and that trees can even improve property value. Next, please. But then it's taking that person who's done a tree planting initiative and converting them into an advocate for land use regulation. That's where the education comes in. So relating those trees to the mangroves and the fact that mangroves need to migrate inland, or the ability to preserve and buy more land for conservation, for water percolation. Likewise, that when we redo our seawalls, we need to vegetate around them and even conserve land and not clear cut. So it's taking that person who's understood the value of trees and native landscaping and having them turn out and care about the land development regulations in their town, or a proposal to revise the parking requirements. It's making that educational connection between something they've experienced and this larger sort of systemic issues. That's where we really start to move the needle. Next, please. And the education, luckily, is where we do find support. We really do. If you look at the data from two of the surveys, the FAU and the Yale data, 78, almost 80% of Floridians believe that we should be teaching climate in school. So while people like Melissa and I and others on this panel today, we're educating the current adults, we're hoping that over time, as the school districts get on board and start teaching the interrelation and intersectionality of climate and social studies and on science, the next generation will be there. And very few people disagree. That little red dot is only 4.5% of people who don't believe that we should be teaching about it. So that's all good news. Next slide. So I often end my topics or my conversations with folks when they're able to talk climate is that we need, while we only have 30% of people talking about it today, we really need to talk about it quite a bit more. And you can't be an expert in in all things, but pick something that you really care about. What gives you joy? Is it gardening? Then think about composting or tree planting. If you're a cook, talk about learning new vegetarian recipes, adopting Meatless Monday. Perhaps you're an exercise fiend and you pick up riding your bike or scuba diving and seeing what's happening to our coral. And then figure out what you're good at and communicate. Communicate your enthusiasm and your personal experiences to friends and family. If you're a good writer, you can write a blog. If you're not a good writer, you can just go onto your social media and when you see a climate article, post it to your friends. When people see that and they respect your opinions and they see that you have now suddenly taken on this dialogue, this climate education dialogue, they will start to listen. And before you know it, you have more people engaging and we're closing that gap from 33% of people who deny it to possibly bringing it down to 11, and then we can get something done. So with that, I thank you so much for your time. Next slide. And here's my contact information. I hope that you might look up Growing Climate Solutions and reach out to me, or if you know of a group that wants to be educated, that's what we're here to do in our region. Thank you so much. And thank you for Jennifer for this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Those two presentations were excellent. And now we're going to go to Q&A with our audience. And audience, if you wouldn't mind, if you're not already logged in, logging in and entering any questions you have for these panelists. And panelists, please feel free to start taking turns responding to as many as you can.
Okay. I guess I'll start. I see some questions here for me. So I see Melissa, are those health effects the same in other states? They're similar in the Southeast. So generally in the Southeast and also in the Southwest, heat is certainly a concern. Extreme weather, hurricanes is a concern, but they are different in other states in that California obviously has more issues with wildfires. We do have some wildfires here in Florida, but not to the effect that California had seen. And in New England, they also have a different set of issues there as well. Our parent organization, the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, which you can find if you go to ms2ch.org. In their annual report, they have a great map that has icons for the different regions of the state, northeast, southeast, southwest, and it shows the different health concerns that are in different regions of the country.
I see that someone asked me, is there a solution to sod on all lawns? That is one of those questions that I've been interested in dealing with. I think the approach there is going to be through the neighborhood associations and property managers, and educating them on the value of native landscaping, that it doesn't have to look like a mess, is one, and having them revise some of the private property, you know, those gated communities. Most land is in private hands. And so, and many of them in Florida are in neighborhood associations that have strict requirements. So this change may be there, getting on the board, presenting to those boards and having them loosen those requirements and allow for more native landscaping that doesn't require so much water. That would be one component of it. I also like to approach that through composting. I want to find a group of people that want to make composting cool. And the fact that if you could compost, you reduce the methane that ends up in the landfills. If you don't move it off your property, you can put it into your landscape beds. You're going to produce quite a bit of it. So you might want to be creating more planting beds and less sod. So that's another kind of interesting angle on getting rid of the sod lawns.
I just want to add to what you said, Dr. Anna, and I've had a worm composting bin at my home for 10 years and it's doing great. And I put all my fruits and veggies in there, and then I produce worm tea and high quality compost that I add to my garden. And you said something earlier too that really struck me, and that is what brings you joy. And recently I've gotten really involved in the Florida Native Plant Society and Florida Association of Native Nurseries. And I've found a lot of joy in trying to plant natives and also looking for butterflies and wildlife coming back to my yard. So I think that's a great way to have joy and also be doing something that's really good. Jennifer, do you want to answer a question?
Yeah, it says, Jennifer, what was the most surprising about the results? And I think that for me, what started as a strategic planning exercise really ended up being a social science exercise, and how important it is to go out and gather input and look at, what are the responses from experts versus what are the responses from the public, and finding out where those disconnects are, or even where the experts disagreed with one another and where there might be potential research avenues that need to be further explored. That was just a really interesting, something totally unexpected when we embarked on that climate change vulnerability assessment. It seems, even the way I presented it, unfortunately, it comes across very dry. But I think if you just really dive into it and look at it, it gets more interesting. And you're like, wow, why is there not consensus on this? Why is there consensus amongst experts, but not with the public? And trying to then dig deeper into that about, well, what does that mean? And how do we use that information to better educate and reach people that we're trying to communicate about this topic with? So I agree, and it fits so well with what the other two presentations highlighted.
If it's all right, I'd like to tackle the one about if we're not supposed to be building on the coast and we don't want to build inland so that we don't use up native or untouched landscapes, where do we go? I love that question. I'm a land use planner by training. And I think the answer is the word that people are afraid of saying. It's called density and reducing parking requirements. We've paved over paradise. Most parking ratios for a mall are designed to fit December 25th at around, or December 24th at 11 p.m. We have very high parking ratios. And if we now, as we are seeing a change in the demand for office space, the types of retail uses, we could redevelop some of the existing built environment, that some of which is old and some of which doesn't meet standards, and look at new zoning and more mixed use, higher density uses. We could accommodate a lot of growth where there is already existing infrastructure, and it's much cheaper to re-densify and rebuild than to go out and plow over panther, landscape out east here. That would be my, my take is we've already developed a lot. We can densify these strip malls, connect them, so that you don't drive out of one onto the street and then turn into the next parking lot, interconnect them, take back some of that pavement, put some landscaping in, make it mixed use. We could do a lot with that.
Yeah, I concur with that. That's exactly what I was thinking too, is how can we redevelop areas that have already been developed and get more use out of them?
Infill.
I wanted to answer, there was a question above about the sugarcane burning. I'm really glad that somebody brought that up. That's definitely an environmental justice issue. So if you aren't aware, many of the crops in the Everglades agricultural area are burned pre-harvest sugarcane burning. And it does tend to, that smoke does come into the neighboring communities. And many of them are communities of color. And so this is an issue that Florida Clinicians for Climate Action has spoken up about, written op-eds in the Miami Herald and Palm Beach Post about it. And what I would advocate for there specifically is that we believe that sugar should transfer to green harvest, which actually has economic benefits because instead of burning the crops, they can retill and do regenerative agriculture where they're doing a green harvest. So they're not creating that PM 2.5 pollution, which I talked about earlier. So I think that's a really important thing. And what you can do as an individual to express your concern about that is to use your vote in terms of using your dollar and buy organic sugar. Because if you buy organic sugar, it is not pre-burned, it is green harvested. So that's one thing you can do to support that movement. And there is a question also about cyanobacteria, specifically as it relates to pregnancy. I'm not aware of any specific studies on exactly that, but I think the points that Anna made earlier in her presentation about how when we have increased precipitation and we have that runoff, that can affect the nutrient loads that can fuel those harmful algae blooms. That is the climate connection for that. And so it's something to be aware of in terms of it is another health impact of climate change. It's not one that I brought up in my conversation, but it is an important one.
There was a question that asked about educating children. And while I am not a specialist in K through 12 education, so I'm going out on a limb here, one of the things I have read is that even at a very early age, connecting kids with dirt, soil, and planting is the first step. Having children not be afraid of digging in the dirt and seeing how the seeds become plants and how plants can be, rot and go back into the earth. That basic understanding of our connection with soil is one of the first steps in education. And from there, as a child progresses and develops a science literacy, that becomes that discussion about the recycling of carbon and how carbon, goes through the carbon cycle and the water cycle. And, but you can start pretty young with just getting comfortable with things, connecting kids to growing and to being outdoors and understanding the fragility of the ecosystem, bugs, things that people don't like to play with, but, it's intriguing to kids and it makes them connected to that natural environment in a way that is really important.
If you want to answer one, Jennifer, you can. If not, I'll take one.
There's one that says, why do you think experts disagreed? And, as with any science, there, especially emerging areas of science like climate research, there's going to be a degree of scientific uncertainty. And so, the body of evidence is growing all the time, and that over time will develop more consensus generally around topics when, there's numerous studies that reinforce the same findings. But as it is, I think what we're seeing is just, a relatively new, I mean, obviously there's been climate research going on for a few decades, but it's been start and stop. And I'm really excited that we're seeing this momentum pick up again at the state and federal level to recognize, as has been pointed out by our other great presenters on this panel, it's all about communication. And until we start talking about it, people will not generally accept, there will not be an interest. That interest then drives political will, drives funding, and then that in turn funds more research and more actions. And so I think we're seeing that momentum pick up again. And that's why it's so important that we have these types of meetings to continue to educate and reach out and grow this community that's talking about this issue.
It's a great point. Yes, and thank you to you for hosting this meeting, which I think has been excellent and fabulous. Regarding the water conservation sustainability specialist, I would say you're already doing the right thing by coming to this meeting and learning. I would encourage you to learn as much as you can, especially as it has to do with climate change, and then try to really understand the water climate connection, which exists in so many ways because it takes energy to make water and it takes water to make energy. And so there's a lot there to work in. So I would just encourage you to learn as much as you can. And then the other question at the top that I saw was, what is the worst climate health impact? And I guess I'll give the lawyer answer, which is, it depends. The thing that really concerns me right now is heat. I view heat as a justice issue because, believe it or not everybody in Florida has air conditioning, and it's going to get hotter. So that's a real big concern. And heat exacerbates so many other issues. So and the research on heat and pregnancy and pollution in pregnancy is really scary. And then the other thing that I didn't talk a lot about, but is the emotional toll, which is also, I think, is going to become a bigger issue as we go on. There's research that looks at Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Suicide rates went up after that because people were desperate. So that's a real concern. And then there's things that, another thing I didn't talk about, but it's very, very rare, but very deadly, are things like brain-eating amoeba and flesh-eating bacteria, PAM and Vibrio. These are two very rare, but deadly diseases. And so they thrive in warmer waters, which we know are going to have, as the water's warm, we could see more cases of these deadly diseases. So there are many concerns, but again, the important thing to remember is that the solutions are double, their climate solutions are health solutions. So as we transition away from these polluting fuels, we're going to, it's climate actions for health and health actions for climate are part of the solution.
If I can just add in on the heat issue, I also talk to people about things they care about, like health, but the economic impact of overall warmer temperatures in Southwest Florida is not to be underplayed, because some of the statistics or data coming out of Climate Central suggest that we had about 26 days a year in the 2000s where the heat index was over 105 degrees. By mid-century, that's going to be like 157 days a year. So maybe half the year, the heat index in this part of Florida, which is more affected than other parts of Florida, will be over 105 degrees. And what does that say about our seasonal economy? We used to be a very seasonal economy. People would come for the nice winters here and then go back north. And then we became a year-round economy. People started staying all summer, and that allowed more growth and more development, more retail, more restaurants, because there was money here all year round. But if it's 105 degrees half the year, that seasonality is going to shorten. So people will come down later because it's going to be more temperate up north, and they're going to leave earlier because it's going to be hot here in April, like this year, where people are noticing that it was 90 degrees in April and it's been 90 degrees this whole past week. And that may shorten our economic season, or have our year-round residents now seek refuge in the Carolinas over the summer. So I totally always play the health angle because people are worried about dying. But people are also worried about what's going to happen to the quality of life here year round. And that people don't make that connection, that just the way the seasonality brought people and developed all of our region, that a change in that seasonality could create a lot of economic stress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points.
Yeah, I would add to that in that flooding ties to this too, because you're talking about changes in precipitation, not overall amounts, but the way it's distributed, coming in like sharper downpours and wetter wet seasons and drier dry seasons, and how that plays into wildfires, how that plays into flooding. And what you're talking about, Dr. Chevlin, about the seasonality plays into that too, because years ago, people would come down, obviously seasonally, and they would have RV camps, for instance, in floodplains along the waterfront. And in the dry season, that's not an issue. But we've seen some of those now convert to year-round communities, and it's displacing water. And as we have more stormwater from increased storminess, from higher precipitation events coming quicker, and without inadequate recovery time between storms, our systems are designed that they have to bleed down after a storm before the next storm. And in Irma, we saw a situation where we had a storm before the storm. And those systems were already at capacity. And so we had incredible flooding, even though we didn't even have storm surges that were predicted. So you have to look at it in all these ways. It's going to affect not just the natural environment, but the human built environment in dramatic ways. And I think people, if they understood that, would be more inclined to dive in to wanting to make this a central issue and have more money and more action, taken on this front. But thankfully, I think it is, in my experience over the past couple decades, it is really growing. This climate awareness is growing in Southwest Florida, and I'm really excited because, it's overdue. We needed to get on this like yesterday.
Yeah. Looks like there's a follow-up to the water utility programming outreach education. I think, certainly encouraging homeowners to conserve water. I think a lot about landscaping and how we use water to water our lawns, or how we could avoid that. Maybe partnering with either FIU IFAS or Florida Native Plant Society to do education to homeowners on the benefits of native plants over traditional sod, trying to get more homeowners to understand how precious water is as a resource, and the benefits of not needing to water your lawn all the time. That's one suggestion, but maybe others on the panel would have others.
One thing I want to add is, the CHNEP has 6 inland counties and 4 coastal counties. And a lot of our inland counties are agricultural based. And I think a lot of times when we talk about climate change, we think a lot about sea level rise. And what Nicole's presentation earlier kind of highlighted is there's different ways that inland communities are going to be impacted, and increased evapotranspiration can definitely drop water tables in ways that affect water availability, but also affect natural vegetative communities, but can also affect crop productivity. And I think that people haven't even really wrapped their brains around that, because that's such a huge part of the economies of our inland counties and communities. And that's something, I feel like we also need to understand. As certainly there's things we can do at our residences, but what are we going to do when Florida is Florida has been like the winter vegetable basket for the country. These changes in temperatures, these changes in water availability are going to affect crops and communities that depend on agriculture as well.
One last comment for the person who asked about water, and I hope they will find my email and PM me so I can send them this information. But in my former life as the sustainability officer in Delray Beach, we were approached by a third-party vendor that had a water conservation curriculum designed specifically for 6th through 8th grade. And with some assistance from the utilities department, it's a citizen science kit with modules for educators, for the teachers, science experiments that are sent home with the kids that they do with their parents about measuring flow and using aerators. And it was highly effective. Their data numbers are fantastic, and it's not completely unaffordable. So I know there are several companies that do that. And if you can find me, I'll try to locate the name of the vendor. We used Boynton Beach, used the same one. And I think everyone was pretty happy with the results. And it's great because it gets kids at a young age. It's based in the science curriculum. It's all internet based with a module with rewards. It's gamified. It was highly successful. So I'd like to just pass that on to folks.
You know, another thing to add to that is that I think that young people, you know, technology is great. It's a wonderful tool, and there's definitely things we are doing and others are doing, I think, to use technology to educate and engage children. But I think there's nothing like a child getting out, speaking earlier about like digging in the dirt, a child who connects to nature, who experiences a joyful experience in nature is going to care about it long term and want to stay engaged in issues that relate around protecting that. So I feel like that's one of the things we need to concentrate on with our youth, is just to give them joyful experiences and maybe not even overtly educate them, but just engage them in you know, activities like hiking or boating, and where they get to experience nature and enjoy it. And hopefully that will translate into them, you know, later down the line doing more to protect it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see the comment about Peace River Audubon has native plant for birds activity book for 4th to 6th grade. That's excellent. And I wanted to make one additional point about agriculture too. When I think about the agriculture industry, it's many ways is the same way as the health industry, in that climate change is a threat, but it's also an opportunity, because there's lots of opportunities in agriculture for regenerative agriculture, for soils to be a carbon sequestration point. And so, and I believe that there was somebody who spoke earlier today about that, about how we can have agriculture as an ally in talking about this, because there's opportunity to make money, there's opportunity to do the right thing and to be a part of the solution. So it's a double-edged sword, but I think in some ways that's good.
To that point, I would just point out that we have a leader from the Office of the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in our attendee list right now. So I think that just shows how they're aware of those connections, and we really appreciate them tuning in. As far as the children's curriculum, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the CHNEP also on our website under our resource tab has Adventures in the Watershed. It's a interactive story map tool for children to learn about the natural resources in the various watersheds that we work to protect and restore. So for those of you who have children or are working with teachers or whatnot, please check that out.
There's one more question here about how do we encourage or legislate better planning? And maybe we can just allude. One, I want to thank Erin Dede for pointing out the work that we did in Delray Beach on that comprehensive plan. Most things in planning have to be rooted in that comp plan to be, you know, viable and above reproach. So when your community does an update to their comprehensive plan or an EAR, you know, it's time to get people to voice their opinion on what they want and the kinds of tweaks. And then it's also one thing, a shout out to the city of Miami Beach. I mean, they moved forward regulation that required all buildings over 7,000 square feet to be certified as LEED Gold. Not that that's the only standard, but that's a pretty high standard. And they applied it to a very small building. And that's a leader in the state of Florida. That kind of over the long haul, as the built environment gets recycled and updated, that's going to make a difference. If we could move more communities to fight that battle and include those kind of goals and objectives in their planning, the life cycle of a building is about 30 to 50 years. It might take a while, but we would start to create buildings that are just more energy efficient and more in harmony with their environment. So moving toward, green globes, if that's your standard, or living building standard, those kind of ordinances are really hard to pass, really hard. The city of Miami is an outlier and outstanding in their ability to do that. But others like Coral Gables have moved in that direction. And there are many others in the state that are doing that. That's another, really positive trend that we're seeing.
Well, we have many great questions here still, but I know we are unfortunately running short on time, going into a short break here before our final panel. So I would